I used to think the little awning attached to the side of my house was the most boring thing anybody could possibly complain about. I mean, seriously, it was beige, half-faded from years in the California sun, and honestly looked like something a retired guy would buy at a hardware store after saying the words, "good enough," 3 times in a row. But apparently, to my new neighbor, that thing was a personal attack on modern civilization. And the crazy part is, I didn't even realize how much that ugly little awning had been protecting his property until he forced me to take it down. So here's the setup. My house sits on one of those narrow suburban lots where the homes are packed so tightly together you can hear your neighbor sneeze through the siding. The west side of both houses took a brutal hit from the afternoon sun every single day, especially during late summer when the heat just sits there like it's angry at everybody. Years ago, before the neighborhood got expensive and everyone started pretending they were architects, I installed a simple retractable awning over my side patio. Nothing fancy, just enough shade to keep my windows from turning my living room into an oven. Now, what I didn't think much about back then was the angle of the sun. Around 3 p.m., that awning cast a long strip of shade that stretched beyond my property line. Technically without crossing it physically, but visually it softened the sunlight hitting the neighboring wall too. Their siding stayed cooler because of it. Less direct UV exposure, less expansion and contraction from heat, less wear over time. Quiet little benefit nobody noticed, until somebody did. Then came Derek. Derek moved in next door sometime in early spring, driving a black Rivian and wearing that permanent expression rich people have when they're looking at something they already plan to change. Within 2 weeks, contractors were everywhere. Trees gone, gravel replaced. Exterior painted some sterile shade of white that looked like an Apple store had a baby with a dentist office. And Derek, man, Derek loved control. You could feel it immediately. The first conversation we had should have warned me. He walked over while I was grilling burgers one Saturday evening, stood there staring up at the awning like it insulted his bloodline, and said, "You ever think about removing that thing? It kind of ruins the sight line from my upstairs office." Not hello. Not nice to meet you. Straight to business. I laughed because I genuinely thought he was joking. He wasn't. A few days later, I got a letter from the HOA. Apparently, someone had reported an exterior structure creating visual obstruction and encroachment concerns. I remember reading that sentence twice thinking, what encroachment? The thing had been there for almost 8 years. So I checked everything. Permits, measurements, installation paperwork, HOA approvals from when the awning first went up. Every single document said the same thing, compliant. I emailed the HOA back, attached the records, figured that'd be the end of it. Nope. 2 weeks later came another complaint. Then another. Suddenly Derek was claiming the awning negatively affected his property value because it interrupted the architectural continuity of the neighborhood, which was hilarious considering half the houses on our street still had plastic lawn flamingos and basketball hoops falling apart in the driveway. But Derek had money, time, and the personality of a guy who absolutely needed to win every interaction he entered. He started CCNG attorneys into emails. He requested formal reviews. He took photos from weird angles trying to make the awning look massive, like I was operating a beachfront resort instead of shading 6 feet of concrete. And honestly, that's the part people don't understand about these neighborhood disputes. It's rarely about the object itself. It becomes psychological. It becomes territorial. Once someone decides they need control over the environment around them, they start treating compromise like weakness. By the beginning of summer, I was exhausted. Every week, there was another email, another complaint, another passive-aggressive conversation near the mailbox where Derek would smile without smiling and say things like, "I'm sure you understand standards matter." Standards? Man, I almost kept the awning up out of pure spite. But eventually I looked at the situation and realized something important. Even when you're right, fighting constantly can drain the life out of your day-to-day existence. So I made the call. Not because Derek won. Not because the HOA had any legal grounds left. I just decided my piece was worth more than proving a point to a guy who treated neighborhood living like corporate litigation. So one Friday afternoon, I hired a contractor, and we took the awning down. The whole thing came apart faster than I expected. A few bolts, some brackets, one long metal frame lowered carefully onto the driveway. And just like that, 8 years of shade disappeared in under 2 hours. I still remember standing there afterward, looking at the side of both houses completely exposed to the western sun for the first time in years. The light hit hard, sharp, blinding, almost aggressive. And Derek? Oh, he looked thrilled. He actually stepped outside while the contractors were packing up, crossed his arms, nodded once at the now empty wall, and said, "Yeah, that definitely looks cleaner." Cleaner. That word ended up aging beautifully. Now let me pause the story for a second because this is where neighborhood disputes get really interesting and honestly, a little pathetic too. People assume HOA conflicts are about rules, but most of the time they're about perception and power. According to standard procedure, HOAs usually care about one thing above all else: consistency. They want homes to look uniform enough to protect property values, or at least that's the sales pitch. But the loophole nobody talks about is that enforcement often becomes selective depending on who complains the loudest. From a legal perspective, Derek never really had a strong case. My awning was permitted, documented, and fully inside my property line. But here's the dirty little truth about civil disputes. You can still lose time, energy, and sanity even when you're technically correct. That's why people sometimes give in. Not because they're wrong, because they're tired. And psychologically, this is a classic control dynamic. This is a psychological trap people fall into when they confuse aesthetic preference with authority. Derek convinced himself that because he disliked something visually, he deserved influence over it. Once that mindset starts, every compromise feels like defeat to them. They escalate because winning becomes emotional, not practical. The crazy part is, nature doesn't care about ego. Sunlight doesn't care about HOA letters. Heat expansion doesn't care who sounded more confident in an email chain. And Derek was about to learn that the hard way. At first, after the awning came down, everything looked exactly the way Derek wanted it to look. Clean lines, uninterrupted sunlight, sharp modern symmetry. His house suddenly looked like one of those overpriced properties you see online with captions like "minimalist luxury retreat," even though the backyard is basically 12 feet of gravel and a sad lemon tree. And I'll admit, for maybe a week or two, I wondered if I'd overreacted. Maybe removing the awning really was the easier solution. Maybe I'd finally get some peace and quiet. Then July showed up. And man, the heat that year was vicious. Every afternoon around 3:15, the western sun started pouring directly into that narrow gap between our houses like a spotlight. Without the awning breaking the exposure, the sunlight hit both walls full force for hours. My patio got hotter immediately. The concrete practically radiated heat back upward, but my exterior wall was stucco, darker colored, built to absorb and release heat more evenly. Derek's house, on the other hand, had brand new light cream vinyl siding, the exact kind of material that looks beautiful in real estate photos and slowly loses its will to live under extreme UV exposure. At first, the changes were tiny. So tiny you'd only notice if you stared at the wall every day like I accidentally started doing. One afternoon, I saw a faint ripple near the center panels. Barely visible. Could have been a trick of the light. A week later, the reflection looked uneven again, except this time it wasn't the light. The siding had actually started to warp. Not dramatically, not movie-level melting plastic or anything. Just subtle ways where the heat repeatedly expanded the material during the day and tightened it again at night. And here's the thing about damage like that. Once it starts, it rarely reverses itself. August came in hotter. By then the discoloration started showing too. Sections directly exposed to the harshest sunlight became slightly duller than the surrounding panels. The difference was almost impossible to see at noon, but during sunset? Oh, you could catch it immediately. Certain strips reflected orange light differently, creating these uneven patches across the wall like the house had developed scars. I remember sitting outside one evening with a beer, watching the sunlight crawl across Derek's siding, and realizing something almost funny. The exact section showing damage was the same section my awning used to shade every afternoon. Like perfectly outlined evidence. And still, Derek didn't notice. Or maybe he noticed and didn't want to admit it yet. People like Derek don't handle being wrong gracefully, especially not when they created the problem themselves. Then came the contractors. One Tuesday morning I heard voices outside and peeked through the blinds. Two guys in polos were standing beside Derek, pointing at the siding while he talked with that frustrated hand motion rich homeowners always do when something expensive starts failing earlier than expected. One contractor pressed on a warped panel and immediately frowned. That's when I knew. A few days later, Derek finally approached me again. This time there was no smugness. No fake corporate smile. Just irritation mixed with confusion. He stood near the fence holding a coffee cup and asked, "Hey, has this side always gotten this much sun?" I almost laughed. Not because I wanted revenge. Honestly, by that point the whole situation felt weirdly surreal. But because the answer was so obvious. "Yeah," I said, "pretty much." He looked back at the wall. "The siding company says heat exposure may be contributing to the warping." Maybe contributing. That phrasing killed me. I nodded and said, "Well, the awning used to block a lot of the direct afternoon light." And there it was. You could literally watch the realization hit him in real time. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just this slow mental recalculation behind his eyes where suddenly all the pieces connected. The shade, the angle of the sunlight, the timing of the damage, the complaints, the removal. Everything. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then Derek asked, "So this only started after you took it down?" I shrugged. That's when the wall started getting full exposure again. Now here's the part that still makes me laugh a little. Derek never apologized. Not once. Instead, he went into problem-solving mode immediately, because people like that would rather spend thousands fixing consequences than admit they caused them in the first place. Over the next month, more contractors came by. Estimates got discussed. Different siding materials were mentioned. UV-resistant coatings. Heat mitigation solutions. One guy even suggested installing a shade structure. A shade structure. I swear to God, I nearly choked when I overheard that. And the irony? Any new structure large enough to properly protect that wall would probably create the exact same visual obstruction Derek complained about in the first place. But by then, the damage was already there. The repeated heating and cooling had slightly distorted entire rows of panels. Once vinyl warps unevenly, replacing isolated sections rarely matches perfectly because the surrounding panels have already faded differently under sunlight. So now Derek had a modern designer house with one side slowly developing visible texture inconsistencies every month. Not catastrophic damage. Nothing lawsuit-worthy. Just enough imperfection to constantly bother somebody obsessed with perfection, which somehow made it worse. Summer eventually started fading into fall, temperatures cooled down, and the progression slowed. But every afternoon when the sun dipped low enough, you could still see the uneven surface reflecting light differently across that wall. Like the house itself remembered what used to protect it. Meanwhile, my patio stayed completely exposed, exactly the way the HOA complaints demanded. Technically cleaner. Technically compliant. Technically improved. And unbearably hot. Funny how that works. The truth is, nobody won that conflict. I lost a useful structure. Derek damaged part of his own exterior. The HOA moved on to bothering somebody else about mailbox colors or trash can visibility or whatever meaningless emergency came next. But every now and then, usually around sunset, I still sit outside and look at that warped siding catching the orange light, and I think about how strange people can be, how desperate they become to control things they don't fully understand. Because the awning was never the enemy. It was solving a problem so quietly that nobody noticed its value until the moment it disappeared. And honestly, that's the part that stayed with me long after the whole thing ended. Not the HOA letters, not the arguments, not even the damaged siding. It was realizing how often people destroy useful things simply because they don't understand why those things exist in the first place. Because if you think about it, the awning wasn't beautiful. It wasn't trendy. Nobody would feature it in some luxury home magazine with soft jazz playing in the background. It was practical, quietly practical. The kind of solution people stop noticing because it works so consistently, they forget the problem was ever there. And that happens everywhere, not just with houses. Sometimes it's a person in the family everybody takes for granted until they stop showing up. Sometimes it's an old policy at work people complain about for years, right up until its removal creates absolute chaos. Sometimes it's a neighbor doing something slightly inconvenient that actually protects the entire block from a problem nobody sees yet. The lesson here is, not every annoyance is useless, and not every improvement actually improves anything. According to standard procedure, modern neighborhoods reward appearance first. Clean aesthetics, open visibility, uniform design. But real life doesn't always cooperate with clean aesthetics. Sunlight, weather, noise, drainage, heat. Those things don't care what looks prettier on a homeowner's Pinterest board. From a legal perspective, Derek had every right to complain. And technically, I had every right to keep the awning. But legality and wisdom are two completely different conversations. One asks, can you do this? The other asks, should you? And weirdly enough, that's where most neighborhood conflicts fall apart. This is a psychological trap people slide into when ego gets attached to being correct. Once someone emotionally commits to winning, they stop asking whether the outcome actually makes life better. They just want validation. Control becomes more important than understanding consequences. And honestly, I think Derek eventually understood that. Not because I lectured him, not because the HOA stepped in, but because every single sunny afternoon, his own wall quietly reminded him. No dramatic revenge, no screaming match, no courtroom victory, just sunlight, doing what sunlight has always done. That's probably why this whole experience still feels strangely satisfying to me. The universe handled the argument better than I ever could have. Nature explained the value of that awning more clearly than any email, permit, or HOA meeting ever would. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have kept fighting to keep the awning up? Or would you have done exactly what I did? Remove it, stay quiet, and let reality handle the rest?